A pandemic is a big word. It's not a term to use lightly, as it tends to cause mass panic and most people associate it with a crisis. But what exactly is a pandemic? The word pandemic is used to describe the prevalence of a disease throughout the world. It has nothing to do with how severe or how deadly the disease actually is. When an outbreak of a disease occurs, it usually starts in one geographical area. If the disease stays within that area, it's called an epidemic. But when the disease starts spreading among many countries and affects a large number of people, eventually it's referred to as a pandemic. Now, this is a pretty broad term, which makes it hard to classify something as a pandemic versus just an epidemic. Both the CDC and the World Health Organization don't specify how many countries or how many people need to be affected for something to be called a pandemic. And different scientists have different opinions on when something should be called a pandemic. One way an infectious disease specialist described it was, "We assume with the pandemic that everyone can be potentially exposed." And that's why when the World Health Organization declared COVID-19 a pandemic, it was a pretty big deal. Now, declaring something as a pandemic is not entirely random. The CDC has some levels to describe a disease before it's referred to as a pandemic. The first being sporadic, meaning a disease is happening infrequently and irregularly. Next is an endemic, which means the disease has a constant presence in a geographical area. After this comes an epidemic, which is a sudden increase in the number of cases and more than what's expected in that area. And lastly, there's a pandemic, which is what COVID-19 is now classified as. Now, we don't get pandemics that often. It's actually pretty rare. You probably heard of outbreaks like SARS, MERS, and Ebola, which scared a lot of people. But those were just epidemics. They never reached that final level. That being said, we have had our fair share of pandemics throughout history, the most recent being H1N1 in 2009. Although this pandemic was less severe than most other pandemics we've had, it still killed between 150 to 575,000 people around the globe. Now, that may seem like a big number, but the CDC estimated that the death rate for this outbreak was just 0.02%. Compare that with the current coronavirus outbreak, which has a death rate of 2%, and we could be looking at millions of more deaths. But there's no reason to freak out yet. These numbers are likely to change for a couple of reasons. The coronavirus is still very new, and we're experiencing a shortage of tests around the world. So the only people who are being tested are those who are already sick. There are still many people who have it right now, but they aren't getting tested since they only have mild symptoms. Keep in mind, 80% of cases are mild and can be treated at home. You could have it right now and not even realize it. We can also compare COVID-19 with the most severe and one of the most well-known pandemics in recent history, which would be the Spanish flu of 1918. This was by far the deadliest flu that we've ever heard of. It infected about 1/3 of the entire population, resulting in at least 50 million deaths worldwide. One of the scariest parts of the Spanish flu was the high mortality rate seen among healthy people. But there were other factors that contributed to this. Keep in mind, this was 1918. Times back then were a little different. For one, scientists didn't even know viruses could cause diseases, and there were no vaccines to treat the flu. There were also no antibiotics to treat any secondary bacterial infections. At the same time, we were in the middle of a pretty big war. Ever heard of World War I? Soldiers who got infected spread the virus across the world. This, combined with poor hygiene habits and people living in very crowded conditions, helped the virus spread as far as it did. So how do these pandemics compare with the coronavirus? We currently have over 250,000 cases and over 10,000 deaths around the globe. But since this is still a novel virus, it's hard to compare this pandemic to previous ones, and it's hard to say when the spread of this virus is going to slow down. Luckily, the world is a little different now. Vaccines are in the making, and the speed at which we can research and develop these vaccines is faster than ever. In the meantime, the only thing we can do is our part and limit social contact as much as possible. Thank you for watching, and if you liked that video, make sure you hit the thumbs up button and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss our new tips every week.